Right, so it's UN Security Council voting on a ceasefire in Gaza time again. And after 3 attempts to get such a resolution passed, which demands an immediate ceasefire, and with the US having vetoed this every single time previously, with the cost in innocent Palestinian lives those votes have been measured in, I can certainly appreciate this news being met with a great deal of scepticism. However, this particular draft resolution for a ceasefire is coming from the US itself, and they are absolutely saying they are calling for an immediate ceasefire. But words matter, phraseology matters, and when you actually look at what their resolution says, they're absolutely not calling for an immediate ceasefire. It is yet another fudge, primarily designed to my mind to get the US itself off the hook for charges of complicity, whilst basically remaining complicit.
We can never let the crimes Russia's committing become our new normal. Bucha is not normal. Mariupol is not normal. Irpin is not normal. Bombing schools and hospitals and apartment buildings to rubble is not normal.
Right, a little clip there from America's second biggest cheerleader for Israel after Genocide Joe himself, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken, just last month, criticising Russia for having blown parts of Ukraine up, with special mention for schools and hospitals, and blowing them to rubble being not normal. Well, I'm very much still waiting for you to say likewise about Israel, because surely them doing it isn't normal either. But I won't hold my breath, because this does very much expose the double standards on show here with regards with the US versus Russia and the US versus Israel, and the exceptions the US along with other nations keep making for Israel right now. So that brings us on to this draft resolution that the UN Security Council have voted on today, brought by the US, they say, calling for an immediate ceasefire linked to the release of all the hostages held by Hamas. Except it doesn't.
Let's get more on this. I'm joined now by diplomatic editor James Bay. So this has just been developing in the last few hours, James. What more do we know about this draft US resolution?
I've got a copy of the draft resolution. Let me tell you first what the Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been saying, because he is been in Saudi Arabia. He's just in the last few minutes landed in Cairo. In Saudi Arabia, before he left, he did an interview with an Arabic TV channel in which he said, we actually have a resolution we put forward right now before the Security Council that does call for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of hostages. Well, this is the document Al Jazeera obtained several hours ago, which is the draft resolution. And I think it's important because at the Security Council, language is very important, and the precision of language is important. For me to read you that key paragraph. The Security Council determines the imperative of an immediate and sustained ceasefire to protect civilians on all sides, allow for the delivery of essential humanitarian assistance, and alleviate humanitarian suffering, and towards that end unequivocally supports ongoing international diplomatic efforts to secure such a ceasefire in connection with the release of all remaining hostages. Now, the language of other resolutions that the US has vetoed have demanded a ceasefire. This one is determining the imperative of. So it says it's important that there is a ceasefire. It's not really demanding one now, and the ceasefire seems to be also directly linked to the release of the people being held by Hamas and other groups in Gaza.
So the US draft resolution bill didn't actually call for an immediate ceasefire at all. It called for the imperative of an immediate ceasefire. Remember I said words matter and phraseology matters. So it wasn't in and of itself calling for a ceasefire at all then, just that a ceasefire needs to come soon, and that this imperative, well, that is all this resolution was contingent on the release of hostages. So in other words, the hostages must be released in order for there to be a ceasefire then? Following up with support all diplomatic efforts to achieve a ceasefire also isn't calling for one immediately. So what is different about this position now compared to the US position before, where things must go Israel's way because that is surely a con? The US position on a ceasefire actually, despite trying to be very clever with its verbiage, hasn't actually shifted at all. They've just tried to use big words to imply that it has. Well, the UN Security Council wasn't having any of it, so why should we? To my mind, this is the US trying to get itself out of a legal wrangle, because by putting forward a resolution which the mainstream media have dutifully reported as calling for a ceasefire, the US can point to this as their attempt to get a ceasefire. Therefore, well, we cannot be complicit in the genocide if we're calling for a ceasefire then, a genocide that continues each and every day, but there is not a ceasefire. This is the US government not thinking about Gaza, not thinking about the destruction, the genocide. This is them thinking about themselves ending up in the ICJ potentially. And certainly I thought that if and when this resolution falls, and it did, they can say, oh, not our fault, we tried, blame those other countries. Well, one country that has vetoed it is Russia, who are also a permanent member state. The text does not explicitly use the word call, instead simply stating that a ceasefire is imperative, which Russia says is too weak. We are not satisfied with anything which doesn't call for an immediate ceasefire, Russian Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky, told reporters on Thursday. Richard Gowan, an analyst at the International Crisis Group, said the US is still not demanding a ceasefire without preconditions. But even this limited shift by the US will worry the Israelis because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to keep the UN out of diplomacy over the war altogether. According to diplomatic sources, the United States now has enough votes, at least 9 out of 15, for the text to be adopted, but there remains the possibility of a veto by Russia. That's what Russia thought about all of this resolution before, and Russia did indeed veto it, as did China, as it turned out. And again, it's another example of the veto being used to overturn a majority vote for a resolution. The majority of countries on the UN Security Council backed even this weak resolution. Yet given this is what the US have done repeatedly on 3 occasions before, used the veto to kibosh actual meaningful ceasefires previously, there's no moral high ground here for them to adopt. Despite that, though, Israel were whinging like mad about the US resolution too, weak as it was, as former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett put out on Twitter that regardless of our political opinion, we strongly oppose external political intervention in Israel's internal affairs. We are an independent nation, not a banana republic. With the threat of terrorism on its way to the west, it would be best if the international community would assist Israel in its just war, thereby also protecting their countries. A just war, he calls it. Just assist us, don't criticise us, and stop interfering from the outside, which is frankly hilarious, when there would be no war without external intervention, mainly in the form of US money, US bombs, not to mention all the diplomatic cover the US has given you at the UN Security Council up till now, protecting your sorry backsides from being forced into a ceasefire by UN resolution. The arrogance is astounding. Israel has been the biggest recipient of US foreign aid since World War II, having had some $158 billion from them and counting. But I suppose when you've had that level of diplomatic protection for so many years, decades on end, pretty much since Israel was established, in fact, 3 generations on as we are now, this is what you get from them. Whinging. Babyishness. There is apparently a second draft resolution that might get heard at the UN today as well. That hasn't been heard at time of writing, so I haven't commented on that in this video, coming after the US one, which has been brought by another 8 nations, collectively I believe, which is calling again for an immediate ceasefire. If that gets the US veto now, let's face it, it almost certainly will, that's going to put the US in an even more embarrassing position on the international stage, where they made so much fuss about backing a ceasefire themselves when actually their position had not changed at all, and any efforts made to get themselves off possible future charges of complicity and genocide, as I believe has been the crux of all of this, will very much be for the birds. The US vetoing ceasefires has done nothing to help the UN's position, where it gets regarded as being weaker and weaker either, the longer it allows the US to get away with acting as it is. But here's a video recommendation showing where there's a potential way through for them on this. Though, of course, the question remains why they have not taken this action previously and whether they ever will. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.